Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today I will be painting up a Inferno Ultramarine from the new Leviathan Box Set, and I'll be doing this in the Ultramarines chapter. As you can see here, I have assembled the model and I'm now about to go and prime it using Macragge Blue spray. This just gives a nice smooth undercoat ready for the other colours and just speeds up getting that initial blue down instead of hand painting it on after an undercoat of, say, black or white. What I have done is, because these models are push fit, which is one very quick and easy for assembly, but the mono posing sort of them makes it a little more restrictive. But what I have done is I haven't actually glued the arms onto the miniature. They are just literally pushed onto their sockets, so that we can take them off later if we need to get to the extra detailing of the front of the model and obviously the other side of the gun. Obviously this isn't compulsory if you're not fussed about the other side, because obviously you won't see it too much, but it is something that I tend to try and do just for sort of personal reasons, so that I know that the paint is there. So without further ado, I'm going to go and spray this up and then we'll be back to crack on. So here we are back after spraying the model in Macragge Blue, and what you can see I've done is also I've removed the arms from the model and just sort of touched up any of the areas the spray can didn't quite touch with Macragge Blue from the pot, and this just again just sort of gives us that nice base coat to work from and keeps all the colour consistent throughout the model. Obviously don't worry too much about the arm pegs or the sockets so much on the painting side, because naturally they're going to get covered up once the model gets put together at the end, and you don't really want them getting sort of clogged up with any paint. So without further ado, the next sort of step we're going to be looking at is blocking in the black cloth areas for the model. So we're going to look at blocking in those black cloth areas, and for this I'm using a contrast paint just because it flows a little bit nicely into the recesses and you don't have to worry so much about getting the consistency right with say a Baden Black, for instance. So for this I'm using Black Legion from the contrast range, and we're just sort of picking out any of those sort of black cloth areas between the panels. So notably there's the ones that sit at the tops of the legs, and also on the backs of the legs and the knee pads and joints themselves. So just work your way around. There is also the arms to look at as well, so depending on what sort of stance the model has at the time, there is the sort of small nature around the base of the glove, and then obviously on the one holding the weapon there is the possibility of there being a little bit in the elbow joint as well, like there is here. So take your time, work your way around and let that dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Once you're happy with how that Black Legion looks, then we're going to move on to blocking in a few more of the black details, but for this we're going to swap over to a Baden Black, just so that we get a nice sort of smoother, more consistent coat, especially over flatter areas where contrast paints don't always tend to sit very nicely. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pick out the belt buckle here on the front of the Marine, and just sort of cover that over. Now you might find that all of these areas will want a couple of coats, but you're going to focus on those areas there, and then also on the Marine the cover for the holster for the gun, for the pistol, and also his little pouches on the back here as well. Now not all the models are obviously sculpted the same, but typically speaking they will all have a pouch or the holster at the very minimum. And then what we're also going to do is setting the Marine to one side, the main body. We're going to come over to the Inferno gun itself, and we're going to pick out the sort of black casing details. So for this is the sort of downward grip here, sort of heading all the way out to the end here, but also the sort of upper part of the casing is around where this sort of purity seal sits. So don't worry so much about this end part, because that's going to be silver, so obviously don't worry again if the black sort of goes over. We don't have to be too neat at this stage because there's obviously other base coats to go on, but you just want a nice sort of smooth coat over these two cylinders, and we can obviously then move on to the next stage. Once you've got that Abaddon Black applied to the model, next up we're going to move on to the next base coat of Lead Belcher, and this is to pick out all the silver details, so namely the parts of the gun casing that we've left over. So the back part here, ignoring the sort of front panelling for the time being, but the back part of the weapon here, and the tip of it at the side here as well, and obviously not forgetting to do the inside as well, and this sort of cog on the top of it. So again, you might need a couple of coats sort of going over those areas, but then on the Marine itself, we're going to come to the backpack and apply silver over the sort of exhaust vents on the backpack here, as well as obviously the top vents and panels as well. Now what I tend to do with these, depending on your particular style, is I sort of coat around the entire outside of the vent area, rather than and obviously leaving the top shell part there, as well as the central node part here. So you don't have to do this particular part. Some people do leave it in blue rather than painting it in the silver, but that is obviously personal choice as to what you would like to do. So work your way around. The last part to remember for the silver is on the helmet here. There are just a couple of sort of small sort of pipes going into it, which is just on the side here. So very carefully, just with a fine tip brush, just paint those in as well. So do take your time, and then come back and we'll move on to the next step. The next part we're going to work on, once you're happy with all those silver details, is we're just going to get a little bit of wraith bone, and this is just to base coat all of the sort of purity seals on the model. Now they can range from where they are, but again, just take a nice sort of small tip brush and just gently cover those over. Obviously try not to get on the areas that you've already painted. If you do happen to touch them with the wraith bone, then you can just neaten up with whichever colour was underneath the first time. So obviously in this case for me is the black casing of the gun, but I know some of them are on the legs of the models or the arms, so obviously just pick out all the ones that apply to your model. The next part we're going to do, again sticking with the main gun compartment, is we're going to get some Balthazar gold, and this is to base coat all that sort of top rim area of the gun at the front, which is obviously where the main housing is for the flame department. So we are going to just base coat this all over this main sort of shielding here. Now if you can go with a slightly darker colour if you prefer, so if you wanted a more bronze colour you can go for that, but once we've got some shading onto this, and we're going to add a little bit of sort of weathering at the end as well to make it look as though it has been fired, this should coat quite nicely as a base coat. So do take your time. Now when you're covering this over the blue, you will find that you'll definitely want two coats, and you'll want to obviously make sure you get into these little holes, as well as the blue undercoat will be quite visible through there if you don't cover those back over. Once you're happy with that Balthazar gold, we're going to move on to blocking in one of the most key details of the model, and that is the gold trim and Aquila on the chest plate here. And for this we're going to move on to Retributor armour, and you're going to want a nice sort of fine tip brush for getting in these detail work, but we are going to base coat the, as I say, the eagle on the chest, and obviously do take your time. If you do make any mistakes you can neaten up with the Macragge blue afterwards, but obviously do try and be as neat as possible. And not forgetting as well, once you've done the eagle, there will be the armour plating on the shoulders, the pauldrons, and there's the trim to those as well. So the easiest way to do this, I find, is to sort of have your brush sort of 90 degrees to the model and just gently run your brush around the trim, and because it's raised, the brush picks it out quite nicely. Again, you may need to just do a couple of passes of this as you're working your way around, but take your time, and then once you're happy we can move on to the next stage. Once you've finished blocking in that gold base coat, we are going to move on to some shading. So the first shade we're going to use is Nun Oil, and we're going to use this in a couple of different ways. First of all, we are going to do some recessed shading on the armour panelling, just to sort of bring out some of those more prominent areas whilst not looking to darken down the entire blue area. Now for this I find it's quite easier to put a little bit of the Nun Oil onto a palette, that way you get a greater control as to how much you've got on your brush. And what we're really just looking to pick out is any sort of details that would be a little bit darker or prominent. So take for example, this leg here has got these vents, and we can just sort of let the recess go into these vents, and already they look darker and more prominent to that. We're also going to, with a fine brush, just drop it into the recesses here. You don't need to be too thick with your line, but just bring it in so that you've got a slightly more darker definition around each of the armour panelling. Now this can take quite some time, and it can be a little bit messy, but the reason we do it now is because you can always neaten up with Macragge Blue before moving on to any highlighting. So do take your time. This is quite a time, as I say, this is a time consuming step, and obviously the more models you're painting, the longer it will take, but I can assure you it does look good, and it does help bring the models more prominent to the finish. Once you've completed that recess shading, we're going to move on to continuing with Nunn Oil, but picking out the more blocked in silver areas. So for the marine itself, we're mainly focusing on the backpack area. So the exhaust vents on the back here just give them a nice sort of small coat, just to give them some more definition, and obviously not forgetting the middle section and also the top vents here as well. And then once you've finished with the marine part, we're going to look at the weapon itself, and just pick out the silver details on there. So predominantly obviously the back part that we did on here. Once that Nunn Oil is drying, we can move on to shading the gold areas, and for this we're going to use Reichland Flesh Shade, and this is obviously for all the areas that we've painted in the Retributor armour, and then also the Balthazar Gold front casing part of the weapon itself. And this just helps give them a bit more of a darkened recess and pick out the details, particularly with the Aquila here, helps pick out all the individual sort of feathers of the wings. So after you've done that, just let that all completely dry, including the Nunn Oil, before moving on to the couple of extra little shades that we're going to add before then moving on to highlighting. So moving back on with the shades, the next one we're going to pick up is Skeleton Horde from the contrast range, and this is just to pick out the parchment of the purity seals on the model. So just straight from the pot, just apply that over the top of the wraith bone just to pick out those details. So you don't need to go too heavy, just enough to give them a nice sort of coverage and pick out the recesses of the ripples. And then for the waxy seal of the purity seals, again we're going to pick up a little bit of the lupus pink and just very carefully coat that over the top, and that dries a really nice pink to mirror a waxy finish. So now with all those shades applied, we're going to pick out some highlighting, and we're going to start off by picking out the armour for using Calgar Blue, and this is just an edge highlight to pick out the sort of sharpest edges. So have a nice sort of fine point to your brush and just sort of pick out anything that would sort of catch the light as you look around the model. So notably the tops of the knee pads here are quite a prominent point, and anything else that would be sharp. So the edges of these armour panels as well would obviously catch the light as well, and helps give definition with them sort of being higher than other panels as well. So, and again on the helmet side here, and obviously not forgetting to look at the equal parts on the arms. So do take your time. This can again be a little bit of a sort of time consuming step, but it does give a nice crisp finish to the model when you're looking at it. So take your time, sort of work your way around the model, and then we can move on to the next highlight. Once you're happy with those blue highlights, we're going to move on to highlighting the black, and the first one we're going to do this is with Fenrisian Grey. And again, similar to the Calgar Blue, we're just going to pick out the edges of the armour that has that. So the belt buckle here on the front, and then obviously the satchel on the back as well. And this is quite a bright highlight, but it does sort of contrast nicely with the black, and picks out and shines the light quite nicely. So just work your way around and just pick out those edges. Once you've picked out the black details on the Marine himself, we're just going to come over to the gun casing, and again sticking with the Fenrisian Grey, just again picking out any of the sharpest highlights. So the brace here for the handle, and then sort of carefully working your way around the edges of the grip at the bottom. So do take your time, work your way around, and then we can pick out the next details. Now the next highlight we're going to move on to is picking out the gold details, and for this we're going to use Liberator Gold, and similarly before, so working on the sort of tips and edges of the Aquila on the top of the model, and just sort of picking out the sort of finest lines on the sort of wings on that chest piece, just to make parts of them stand out a bit more, and trying not to block any of that recessed shading that we've done before. And again, similarly with the shoulder pads, you'll just want to pick out the sort of parts that pick out the light the most. So if you hold the pieces as if they were going to be on the model, so for example it would be the sort of top patches here that would catch the light the most, so you would just sort of do a patch in the middle there, which then obviously makes that really shine in comparison to the rest of the gold plating. Now it's at this point that I would say it's safe to put the model now fully back together again, so we're just obviously putting the gun back in place and giving it a bit of a push into place. Now obviously I haven't glued the model onto its base yet, so it did just pop off that bit, but obviously if you brace the model and then you can just push the sockets back into place. You can obviously glue them if you wish, but I have to admit these do fit in quite nicely, and I wouldn't really say that glue was 100% necessary at this time. But there we go, already it is looking quite formidable and ready for the tabletop. But we've got a few more highlights to do yet. So the next highlight we're going to do is Rune Fang steel, and this is for all the silver detailing. So we're just going to be picking out the edges of that gun casing here, as well as any sort of raised parts that are on there. So these sort of square and circular pieces, pick those out, and then obviously the nun oil set in the shades will stand out and look a lot more defined. And then not also forgetting the backpack fence as well. And same as before, just pick out the top edges and the rims, say, of the exhaust fence, and then the rest of the metalwork shows very nicely. And then what we're also going to do, just to break up this black a little bit on the canister here of the Promethium, we're going to just sort of highlight with the silver over the rim of that canister, which sort of goes around it. As I'm guessing sort of holding rim of it itself, and we'll just go around that with the Rune Fang steel, and that just helps sort of break that up a little bit, as well as making it look a little bit more interesting. Once you're happy with those silver highlighting, we're going to move on to putting the red into the eye sockets. Now for this we're going to use Mephiston red, and you're going to want a nice fine tip to your brush and a very steady and braced hand. So I hope you're going to be able to see this all right on the camera. I'm going to try my best to not muck it up whilst trying to show you what I'm doing, but you're just going to gently touch your brush into the socket itself, just to give that nice red onto that face mask there. So that one has gone on quite nicely. I'm not sure how easy it will be to show you it from the other side, but I'm just going to sort of tilt the model gently onto its side and pop that in there as well. So there we go. And then already that helmet is looking very nice and finished. And then as a final highlight, we're going to get a little bit of Emperor's Children, just to pick out the edges of the top of the Purity seal itself, just to make those stand out a bit better. So I mentioned earlier on in the video that we were going to make this sort of gold trim here to the gun look a little bit more interesting. And what we're going to do there is we're just going to darken off the ending of it to make it look like it's been used, to make it look like it's a bit burnt up. And for this we're going to go back to our nun oil, and we're going to use this straight from the pot, not thinning it down at all. And we're just going to focus predominantly on the end areas here. So we're just going to darken it right down. So you can be quite liberal with how much you put on, because we want this to stand out. But don't go all the way down, go about sort of halfway. And obviously don't forget to do the top and the back as well. And I would recommend sort of getting all this initial sort of coating on first. And then what we're going to do is, once you're happy with how much is on the model, just wash off your brush gently. And then just sort of start to try and make that, pull that into the rest of the model, so that the very ending part here sort of blends more into the gold, to make it look as though that it's obviously been a more natural gradient rather than a stoppage of line. Now obviously what we don't want, which is exactly what's happened here, is it's pulled quite considerably. I was a bit heavy with what we've done, so you can just use your brush to take it away and then obviously pull and feather it from there. Now this is a sort of stage 1 to this process, and obviously not forgetting to put some on the end to make it look more burnt, but we need to make sure that this part here is fully dry before we move on to the next step. Once that first coating of nano oil is dry, we're going to go back to nano oil again and apply a second coat of this, but this time we are just focusing right on the very edges, and this is just to darken down all of that sort of metal work. And you don't need to go sort of too heavy with it, but we're just going to go on a little bit thicker than we did before, just to really apply and make it look a lot more blacker than it was before, to make it more charred, as if it has been used frequently. So we're just going sort of for the very end, and if you do find that it's sort of gone over where you don't want it, then again just wipe your brush off and pull it to the right areas, and then just let that dry, and you should have a nice simple black muzzle burn to the end of your flamers. And there we have the finished Inferno squad member for the Ultramarines, and all that's left to do now is base the model in whatever scheme sort of fits the rest of your army. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions at all, just leave them in the comments below. I know we'll come back to you. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks.